So this right here is meant to be my new GT1010 from Nvidia, which I ordered from China, but we'll be getting into that story a little bit later on in the video. The real question is, did we actually get sent a brand new Nvidia Geforce GT1010, something that according to most people doesn't actually exist? And it looks like from that, we actually got one. I really can't capture just how rare and strange this card is, as every listing for it seems to return results that are either completely out of stock, or have such a small shipping radius, they seem nigh on impossible to actually order. But with that having actually arrived, what do you actually get inside the box of Nvidia's rarest graphics card? Right, well this is the first time I've ever seen a GT1010, yet alone one that's actually branded and in the box. And my first takeaway is, why is it only the lowest end graphics card that no one even believes is real comes with an awful CGI render on the box? That's what I want. That's a mascot right there. That's brilliant. It's not quite Frobot the Robot, but it's something. On the box itself, game ready, Nvidia Pascal. I don't think there's all too much interesting actually going on here. I mean, included in the box, just the graphics card. And there's another interesting point. The minimum power requirements based on a PC configured with an Intel Core i7 3.2 GHz. We don't actually know what i7 it's with. And then you've got the specs of the card, which includes Vulkan and DirectX 12. I still can't believe this thing's real. I don't think there's anything else interesting. That's enough. Let's find out what's actually in the box. What is the GT1010? Because I've not opened this yet and I want to find out. We've got a dongle, we've got foam, we've got more foam, the quick start guide, that I can't read. I'm assuming that's my warranty card, which I can't fill out. And there we have it, the GT1010. It is real. Now that is a graphics card right there. The GT1010 in its true form. They've even got the dragon. They've even got the dragon on the fan. At least they've got a mascot. That's something. And then we've got a dongle here, which is... that is weird. That is a HDMI to VGA. I have never had a graphics card come with a VGA adapter. How is that even powered? We'll have to try that, because on the back it also says compatible with Windows 7 32-bit. It's going to be a long video, and that is it. So why don't we find out if the GT1010 works? Also, this is just a side note. GDDR4, that lasted for about a year when, the 2900 XT came out, I think? Why does it say GDDR4? What is going on with that? That's just strange. All that's really left to do is to find out what happens when you plug it into a PC. So while we get this all installed, let me tell you how I managed to actually get a hold of this graphics card. See, I found an expired eBay listing from a few months ago selling what claimed to be GT1010 graphics cards, brand new and exported from China, which makes sense given that it seems to be the only market that these things ever got to. And despite not having any in stock, they told me that in the coming weeks they would be eventually putting more up for sale. And these things weren't cheap, keep in mind. But eventually, come the 1st of October, they did put one up for sale, and it cost me $84 imported, which makes this one of the most expensive graphics cards we've tested on budget builds for a long while. And when you order graphics cards from China, given the reputation they kind of have for being scams, well, you never really know what you're going to get, and it seems like the more you spend, the more likely it is you're being ripped off. Which brings us to where we are today, where we actually got one, and the graphics card is all here, fully branded, and apparently working. After letting things run and update for a little while, eventually everything showed up as working. We were on the latest available drivers from Nvidia, as they do list this card on their website, and no drivers actually come with the card. It all showed up in GPU-Z. Sadly, the first bit of lies on the box were made very clear, as there is no GDDR4 on board here. You might remember from the beginning, it has that big label put across. Nope, that is still reserved for that little slice of early AMD era graphics cards, so this here is your standard and very boring DDR4. But the rest of it all checks out. I even started to go through the drivers, which is where the real power of the card started to show through. See, in the driver menu, trying to put this thing onto high performance mode, whatever that means, the card lags.
No word of a lie, it doesn't matter what operating system you're using, what drivers you use, it doesn't matter what situation you give the card, it immediately sets off these red flags as you have a momentary pause between trying to select options and change things. You know, I've never seen an Nvidia graphics card struggle with its own drivers, not even absolute bits of wet cardboard like the MX440 struggle like this does. So already, we kinda know where we stand with the GT1010. But before we get into those ever so crucial performance figures, what are the specs of the GT1010? And is it actually that bad on paper that it should be lagging in its own drivers? Releasing in apparently 2021, but only becoming mainstream, if you could even call it mainstream, in 2022 and onwards, the GT1010 is really something to behold. A brand new Nvidia graphics card featuring 256 CUDA cores, 16 TMUs, 8 ROPs, and 2GB of DDR4 memory, struggling to do anything at all through an absolutely minuscule 64-bit memory bus. It does, however, come based on the GP108 variant of the Pascal architecture, meaning that it is remarkably modern somehow. So you get modern features like DirectX 12, Vulkan, all of these are supported. There are no clear signs of pricing, and given this cost me about $50 before any import and shipping fees, that's about the best you're going to find. It isn't listed anywhere on AliExpress, Amazon, anywhere really. You can't buy these easily. So my only knowledge on pricing is what I've paid today. And as a fun note, according to Tech Power Up, these have already been discontinued, so there appears to be even more mystery and intrigue for the GT1010 than we first thought. Now that it's all set up though, don't worry, I've tried to cover virtually everything possible here in this video, but I don't really want to hold off too much from the part that everybody wants to know. Whenever a new 10 series card releases, it's almost a rite of ritual to find out just how bad it does. But I went into this thinking, you know, this is modern, it's got an alright amount of VRAM, it's based on a very good architecture, and it certainly costs enough to imply you'll get some performance. And I was very much mistaken. So please do enjoy some of the most underwhelming, confusing, and ridiculous benchmarks that you may see in a brand new graphics card in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks with what seems to be the entry-level go-to nowadays, and is something I've tested on all entry-level Nvidia cards at this point, with GTA 5. And even here, performance was okay at best, really setting the tone for what's coming forward. The game was running with the best settings I could find for it, meaning high textures, normal everything else, and the slightly redeeming feature of soft shadows, all the while it's running in a 1080p resolution. And part of me was dead impressed, because remember, usually with the GT210, the GT610, even the 710, you're usually running this game in 480p with no shadows, struggling to get 30 FPS. And this card is 12 years newer, so it does have 12 years worth of improvements. But it's just the pricing. See, with slow memory and an awful memory bus, there was tons of pop-in, which was a major issue, loading the game could be very rough at times, so 30 FPS is just about playable but not brilliant. The good news is, though, that performance is so underwhelming in single player that when you jump into the world of GTA Online, you lose only a couple of frames here and there, generally hovering around 25 to 30 FPS, which isn't actually too bad, given that most cards suffer a bigger performance hit than this. So the card is so bad, it can't actually do worse in GTA than it's meant to, if that makes any sense. So GTA 5 and GTA Online do run 30 FPS, okay-ish settings, but not the best experience in the world because there's tons of pop-in. Red Dead Redemption 2 was a complete nightmare, so brings us back to reality a little bit, as low settings go over the VRAM limit, meaning the game defaults to a weird mixture of ultra settings where you can't turn the settings back down again. So, brilliant. It meant that we had to go back to the classic 10 series bit of benchmarking, where you open up the INI file and manually tweak every setting down to the lowest it can be, all the while trying to run the game in the lowest resolution it would run without resetting. And we managed to achieve with these settings 17 FPS. that's about as good as you're going to see. If I was really clutching at straws, you could say the frame times aren't too bad, but we also tested a direct competitor to this a few weeks ago with the R7 450, and that got double the frame rate, all the while being a lot more common and a lot cheaper. I even added new games to the benchmark suite for this, with Baldur's Gate 3, and it was awful to set up as the game defaults to 1080p with ultra settings, ensuring the menus run at under 1 FPS most of the time. After wrestling with the game's settings, seriously, I'm dragging the mouse and have to wait about 10 seconds to find out where it's actually gone. Well, we eventually got the game down to its very lowest in 1024x768, and things were smoother. Not good, but smoother, with the game now averaging anywhere from 15 to 20 FPS most of the time in one of the easier to run parts of the game. It doesn't matter if you use DirectX or Vulkan here, the game was the same slideshow throughout, and this was about as good of an experience as you could get. I don't know if there's ultra-low performance mods out there for this yet, but you're gonna need them if you wanted to see anything playable on the GT1010. BeamNG ran alright in 720p with the low preset, something I'm saying a lot this video, and in simple scenarios could even see between 40 to 60 FPS. This was of course just throwing the truck off a cliff in one of the easier to run maps. Higher settings would absolutely decimate the frame rate, as would resolutions, and more intensive maps could halve the frame rate down to around 30 FPS, with drops now to the mid-20s when a lot of foliage was on screen. I mean, it's not bad to see BeamNG running on what is entry-level hardware, and compared to its predecessors that can't even run the modern versions of the game, well, it's brilliant to see. It's just compared to its competition, it's awful. Downright awful. Counter-Strike 2, on the other hand, was actually okay. We were in 1024x768 again with the lowest possible settings, and it was just about playable, with intense situations bringing you round to the mid-40s and general gameplay often hovering around 60 FPS. Not competitive, but compared to what we've just seen in the last two titles, not actually awful. Smokes and heavy effects could cause some minor stutters because we've got a tiny memory bus, but still, you can actually play Counter-Strike 2 on what is a low-end display adapter. It didn't stop me being awful at the game, and it did run, poorly in some places, and it didn't look good, but it's nice to know that at least this will run. Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord ran with the low preset in 720p and averaged 46 FPS throughout most of the benchmark, which isn't too bad and is far from the realms of being unplayable. Yes, it might look so ugly you could confuse it for Warband, and no, there aren't any shadows enabled, but it did run alright. I will say though that when we swap to my own usual large battle benchmark, as I do gameplay in this rather than just trusting what the game says it will run at, the game did suffer, now hovering from the mid-20s up to the low 30s. Still not unplayable, but a far shoot away from a 60 FPS experience, so I can only assume that into the late game, things are really going to suffer here. Skyrim Special Edition originally wanted to default to ultra settings. I have no idea if this is some cruel trick by developers, that it just assumes the GT1010 will do ultra and everything, but after relegating it down to the low preset, we were able to manage a console-like experience with slightly worse frame times and slightly worse graphics. It didn't matter too much if you drop things down to very low, as with our limited memory bandwidth, you're not really going to be pushing 60 FPS in this title, so try to make 30 FPS look as good as possible. Often hovering around this is pretty much just what the game wants to do anyway. It was responsive enough and playable enough even in towns and cities, and this is a remaster, so it actually does look pretty good with the lower settings. Just not a great way to play the game. Thankfully, in some more positive news, in 20-year-old titles, it does alright. Not brilliantly, but alright. 2004's Fable the Lost Chapters running here in 1080p, with the highest option selected, and we saw a consistently good frame rate. Now, a lot of cards have been able to do these settings and these frame rates for years, but it's finally entered the realms that a display adapter in the lowest of tiers can run it maxed out at 60 FPS. Which really is me trying to find a positive here. So you get sort of 2004 flagship performance in a small package. which by itself doesn't sound too bad. Just keep in mind you can buy a 2004 flagship for about £3 probably, and this is about 50 quid. Just to see if anything weird was going on here, I loaded up one of the worst ports of all time with GTA 4, and with 1080p and a weird mixture of settings, we almost managed to get a consistent frame rate without a cap. Emphasis on the almost, as it took some time for the frame rate to stabilise, but when it did, it didn't seem too juttery or bad to play. So for some of those older titles, even the ones that run kind of weird on flagship cards, the GT1010 brings out its subtle advantage of having just enough modern features to run games, while being not powerful enough to cause problems in older titles, which is polite enough to say, it's bad enough to run weird ports. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, weirdly enough, no. I tried multiple sets of drivers, I tried the Steam port, I tried the EA port, I tried the GOG port, and they all had the same effect. The game would load up, it would recognise the card as a GT1010 and update the settings config, and then the game would promptly crash. So no, the GT1010 can't run Crysis. Maybe it would stand a chance if I could get the game to load up, but even after a few hours of trying to make it do something, I just can't make this card launch the game. I tried a different system, I tried different drivers, I tried everything, and for some reason, it just won't launch on this card. Maybe it's a problem with my one, maybe I need to go back to using Windows 7 or something to get it to work, but here, no luck. So how would I rate the GT1010 in the benchmarks? Well, for an entry-level display adapter, it's passable. But as a display adapter, which is what it's meant to be, it can churn out a picture just as well as its predecessors from up to 12 years ago. And with most processors coming with what seem like capable iGPUs, both AMD and Intel now, it doesn't seem like the card is just a display adapter, as when you throw in pricing, it's awful. Its own competition from AMD consists of cards from a similar era, like the R7 450, which came out in 2020 and 2021, and reached its peak in 2022 like this card did, and manages either higher settings or higher frame rates. It struggles to fit in anywhere, which may explain its rarity. It's not better at displaying than anything else, it's worse in gaming than its competition, both new and used, and the only thing it has going for it is the novelty of it being the GT1010, the best low-end card from Nvidia. So I'm struggling to place this card because if it was cheap, those benchmarks aren't bad, but given its pricing and its rarity, that is downright terrible. In terms of the boring stuff like temperatures and power consumption, it does have one major advantage. It uses no power at all. Genuinely, it tops out at 28 watts, even under full load, and you cannot make this thing get warm. You can't even get the fan to ramp up on it. I left it running the new Furmark stress test for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, nothing happens. It hits a high 40-degree temperature, sometimes dipping into the low 50s in a single hotspot, and that was it. So in terms of temperatures and noise, it has one big advantage. This thing could probably run passively, and it'd still be fine. Sadly though, there was a lot of speculation that these cards would have NVENC compatibility, which is, the ability to record and transcode on the graphics card, and that would be a major selling point for them, and they don't have it. I tested a few sets of drivers, I tested different software for compatibility, and it does nothing. OBS says to check drivers, or the card, and it looks like Nvidia has cut one of the most redeeming features this card could have. This could also be like on the AMD side, where for some reason certain versions of the chip don't get hardware encoding, but there is no evidence online, and there's no evidence in person, that this card supports hardware encoding, which seems mysterious, because why would you take away the one feature that would make this card good? Because suddenly, new NVENC support, well, you've got a card that can handle all your encoding. That'd be brilliant. Yet, in reality, it doesn't do that. It is nothing more than a glorified display adapter. You'd think though, given that this card seems to be so cut down, has tons of thermal headroom, and there might be a decent chance of being able to get a good overclock on these things to improve performance, but they don't budge. I managed to get 300 MHz more on core, and 50 MHz more on the memory, which originally I was going to make a big section about. I've recorded tons of footage on this, but the results are so boring and tedious that even with these increases, you're so crippled by how cut down this card is that beyond 1 or 2 FPS in games, it doesn't really improve things at all. Maybe the frame times could be slightly smoother in some titles, but that's all there really is to it. Going any higher than this would crash the driver, or even the PC if you went too far. The only real upside to any of this overclocking is that I now have a legendary achievement in 3D Mark and are one of the top 10 overclockers for the GT1010. I'm representing the UK for GT1010 overclocking, and I'm bad at overclocking. So, not many people are overclocking these things, and it seems like given I got on the board just by running this thing stock, I'm assuming that Colourful, the brand behind the version we have here, are already pushing the most boosted clocks right out of the box, realising that any more do not net you any performance. Seriously, there's no point showing you any benchmarks because it performs the exact same. There is no difference to overclocking this graphics card because it is so cut down. But there was that one little extra thing, wasn't there? This card came with a VGA adapter designed for older PCs, which is mostly where I'd imagine you'd see this thing, or would if it ever got a real release. And sadly, even with the included VGA adapter, it's near enough completely useless. It just drops out constantly whether you had drivers or not. I'm assuming that the ports on this card can't actually provide enough power for active conversion, which is a common issue on HDMI adapters, not so much with DisplayPort, but it can still happen, so it seems silly to even include it in the box. It gets worse though, as once again, this was going to be a bigger section of the video with testing the world of retro compatibility. But that box was filled with even more lies. You know how it claims support for Windows 7 32-bit and upwards? Well, you can scratch that off the list pretty much instantly. There are drivers that support Pascal for older operating systems, but when I attempted to install them on Windows 7 32-bit, they don't support the GT1010 because it doesn't exist yet. And these drivers are from 2018. These are the recommended drivers from Colourful, and they don't work. These drivers support Fermi. That's how old they are. They don't even know that the GT1010 exists. And I did reinstall and do some testing on the 64-bit versions, and they do work on Windows 7. But even then, if you're going to be using it with the VGA adapter, the moment you open any aero effects or even just keep a window open, the display drops out completely. It didn't matter what monitor you use, if you use the included adapter, you'll be getting absolutely nowhere. And trust me, I spent hours troubleshooting this, and it simply doesn't work. So that there about brings us round to the end of this review on the disappointment that is the GT1010. And what are my thoughts? Well, if this card actually became mainstream enough to replace the GT210, which is still Nvidia's most common cheap card, living beyond the GT610 and the 710, then maybe I would call it redeeming. As a new card in that £20 to £30 segment, well, it'd be okay, because at least you're playing classic games in high settings, you've got modern drivers, and some of those 2010s titles even work okay in 1080p. But that's not what's happened. It's a rare card that's only worth owning for the novelty. Most people that have these either seem to laugh at them, or bought them because they're from Korea or China, which is the only market they ever seem to have made it to. You know, most of these graphics cards are paired with FM2 era stuff. From what I've done in my research, the Athlon 2 X4 860K, if you remember those chips, is one of the most common pairings with the GT1010 today. So there's no information on these. I've done the best I can. I didn't want to just laugh at the thing. I wanted to actually give an in-depth review. But all I can say is, if this product was available for 20 quid on Amazon, like the old ones used to be, hands down, it'd be alright. But they're not. They're going to set you back 50, 60, 70 pounds to even get a hold of one, at which point, just buy something better, even a GT1030, a GTX 1050. If you really wanted something cheap, the £5 to £15 R7 450 from AMD outperforms this and does the same job and even has hardware encoding. And that's not me being an AMD fanboy, it's simply facts. It's just a better card. Don't buy one of these. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.